Hallo Freunde und willkommen .NET API Review. Wir haben drei Etwasen heute. And I'm pretty sure I said the heute in the wrong order. So, welcome to .NET API Review. We only have 3 issues, so we have a short day today. And I'm still being brave and practicing German on the internet where people can hear me. Even though I don't have a reason anymore. Yeah. So, let's just go ahead and skip the first one and see if Steve randomly shows up. Alright. Add enumerable concat overloads for variadic arguments and nested enumerables. I don't even know what that means. 54220.
Yeah, my bad for that title, but basically this proposal is to add more overloads for concat in enumerable. So if you can scroll down to the actual proposal, we currently have one extension method that concatenates the source enumerable with another enumerable that you're passing it. And this is basically a proposal to essentially add concat for an IEnumerable of IEnumerables, which is something that I've very frequently needed, and the workaround is typically to do select many x fat arrow x. And the second proposed method is a variant of that. It is a static method that lets you pass a list of IEnumerables as params. So that's the proposal.
I mean, I was going to say it's just select many.
Yep.
Just wanting to call out that if this is accepted, given that C# 11 is explicitly trying to get params of span in, would we want to leave a special annotation considering that, if they do approve it, to switch it to be params of span?
Honestly, I wouldn't bother because, I mean, we have a ton of params that are not span-based, so hopefully they prefer the span one when it's present, right?
Right, I believe that's the intent. My question here was mostly, since this is a new API, if the same release we add this new API, .NET or C# adds the support for the quote-unquote better thing, then should we, and the better thing will always be preferred, then should we worry about having both?
I mean, I probably wouldn't care because, I mean, it's the same thing, right? We have probably hundreds of them already, so if it's 100 or 102, probably doesn't make a difference.
Also, this is a link method, so I don't think it would be that important.
Yeah, I mean, we'd save like 50 bytes out of the assembly.
Yeah, I mean, it might be worthwhile to just, once span is in, just do a pass over all the params one we added this release and then maybe knock them all out, if that makes sense. But, I mean, I don't know what the downsides would be. I mean, presumably VB would be able to also call them. If not, then that might be a counter argument.
Yep. I was going to say that's a very impressive presumption because I think we'd have to teach it an entire new params model.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the compiler would have to be aware. So yeah, I guess the better assumption is VB won't be able to use this API.
Yeah.
So that might be a good reason to still do the object one anyway. Or the array one, I should say.
I have a question actually. Like, do we have precedent where we are using the same method name for both a static method and an extension method? You can kind of see in the usage examples that it's being used in both ways, and I'm not sure if that's kind of considered normal.
I mean, it's an interesting question.
I mean, yeah, I think for the second one, the more pattern matchy thing would be that it was this enumerable first, and then params enumerable catter. I don't know what to call it without using a list board. So overload it here.
Yeah, that seems more natural, right?
I have
like
technology for this.
It seems a bit odd to make that a static method.
Wouldn't that conflict with the second concat overload we're adding, or am I mistaken?
I mean, I
just a
honestly
moment
wouldn't,
to be able to doodle.
I wouldn't even bother with the third one, to be honest, or the second one, I guess.
Yeah, I think we could live without that.
All right, so instead of
Seconders.
or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, that would let you concatenate with nothing, right?
Turns out that's
Correct.
real easy. If rest.length is 0, return first.
Yeah. Although, yeah, that seems fine though. I mean, you would have to handle the empty case anyway.
Yeah, I don't care.
So yes, I mean, the caller could omit the argument, but
Yes, I mean we could also do first, second rest if we want. But
Yeah, you also could have done it in the first place already, because you could have just done enumerable.concat a, and it would have allocated an array to contain a single enumerable and then effectively returned just a. So no matter what you do with params, there's always a way to only specify 1 or 0 arguments.
right. I mean, overloading it with the first one might be more intuitive because of the way IntelliSense works when you're commaing into it. But
So if you had an enumerable of int, say, and you did concat with no arguments, which of the two methods, of the two new methods, would it resolve to?
It prefers the exact match over creating an array.
Okay.
yeah.
This is also why many of our methods that take params have overloads that take 1, 2, and 3 args, to avoid allocating in the common cases where you only have 1, 2, or 3 args.
I mean, as it stands, I kind of find the first signature kind of awkward. So, would it make sense to just can that one and just keep the second one? Because I found uses for the second one. I've never really needed the first variant.
I mean the first one is that instead of going you just want to say, right?
Yeah.
Like this one is the one that I think we don't need, because that's just select many.
And the second one, if we were to have it, I think would be better handled by params enumerable of sources, which is supposed to be coming in C# 11 with the general params span support. If we were to have it, that is.
Yeah, I mean, the second one as an instance seems weird. I think if we were to do the second one, I would probably make that as a static. That seems more like what people really expect to call. I guess maybe because it's on Enumerable.
Yeah, because this would be like that looks weird to me.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been known, like an alternative name for that particular variant is flatten.
Yeah, as Jeremy said, select many, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I select many is hard to discover, right? Because I guess what I actually want is I'll pretend that I know C#. Right? Because like that is the way that you do this right now. It's not
also
obvious.
It's also quite a bit more expensive than concat. It's going to incur a delegate invocation per enumerable value, whereas concat is just going to implicitly know I can optimize based on I'm always getting identity.
I mean, we could just overload select many with no arguments, right?
Yeah, that as well.
Which seems maybe more natural.
Mm.
I mean, I've literally written this line of code x goes to x a million times. It's always like, why do we not have an overload that takes nothing?
Yep.
The same is true with order by the way. Like, if the thing already is orderable, like, it seems weird to say order by x goes to x, but I've done this also a million times. Like, it seems generally that there's some value in overloading the existing ones and maybe remove some of the parameters in some cases.
Maybe that's something we should look at more holistically on how can we improve existing cases where you want to do an identity operation, either by removing the parameter or even if that's difficult due to overload resolution, having some magic identity delegate that's globally cached we can check against.
I feel like the notion of have an public identity delegate comes up a lot, and we never do it, and I don't know why. I think because we don't know where we would put it.
I mean, one option would also be to just change the compiler to leverage that, right? I mean, because the problem is, once it involves generics, it might be really shitty to reference anyway.
I don't think the compiler doing it works. There has to be something for the library to be able to check against. That way it can say, if the delegate is the identity delegate, I can optimize based on that. The purpose of it isn't to like globally cache all of the delegates here. It's to say, I know that this functionality is well defined, and therefore I can do something more efficient than calling the delegate every time.
Right. My point is the compiler could basically, when you write x goes to x, the compiler could say, oh, I know it's an entity conversion, so I might as well just burn in whatever the freaking API is, right? And then the callee could just say, no, you just compare the delegate instance against the well-known one, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like if we ask everybody to change the line of code from x goes to x to reference the static one, then that might be a losing proposition because many people won't do that.
I was just going to say, I think if we did expose it, the most logical place would be to have an action.noop and a functu .identity.
Yeah, we probably can't put it there, but we can probably have a static func type that has a method that, well, the method would be shitty now, because now you have to call the method, but yeah.
Or I guess Link uses predicate, which is a different issue as well.
Yeah, that's also true, but I feel like there is we don't have a good way to put it. I mean, one of the problems is we want something that is also that allows generic inference, otherwise it's a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
Which is maybe easier to just say you keep writing x goes to x and then the compiler does that.
Right, I meant more for the thing that the compiler goes to that we could know is well defined.
Yeah.
Like if the most logical place to put it would be func tu and predicate tu dot identity conversion or something.
Yeah, just
or no.
The only thing is we probably can't put it on the delegate itself, right?
I mean, instead of using the keyword delegate, we could write what the compiler produces when you write the keyword delegate and write that as literal C#, and then we could throw extra stuff on it. It would confuse people, but we could do it.
Yeah. I mean, just coming back to this one here, I mean, I feel like the concat one as a static, as the extension of Enumerable, I don't think anybody liked. What about the first one? Do we have the first one, or do we only have a static one that takes ABC as arguments?
I like the one that's an extension method. I think it's much more natural to do a dot concat BC, and because it's an extension method, you can still do enumerable dot concat ABC if you really want to.
Actually, that's a good point. It would work as a static as well. It would be reasonably readable. Yeah, I think I like that. Yeah, my concern with having a static one is just it's not discoverable because people are just trained that concat exists, and if it exists as an instance method and you don't find the overload, people will conclude that it doesn't exist. I don't think they will delete the code and start with the static invocation to see whether there's anything there. So then I guess the question just becomes, if we only have this one, what overload do we do? Do we have this first, comma, second, comma, rest, or do we just have this first, comma, rest?
I think it would be this comma rest, because that's how we do it in other APIs like string concat and stuff. We don't do first, second, third rest. We have just rest, and then there's overloads that are first or first, second.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that we would consider first, second rest here is, I think, would be the just to avoid the zero case.
Yeah, for me, I mean, like as Tanner said, like you don't really avoid it, right? Because if you have first comma, second comma, rest, I mean, you still have the zero case for the third, right? So the code would always have to handle it.
Sure, but I mean, this is a legal line of code. It's probably not what you wanted. I mean, we can say we don't care.
I think the main concern here is that if we actually end up shipping the second method with the nested enumerables, if somehow the source changed from enumerable of enumerable of int into enumerable of int, say, then suddenly you're using a different method, and I think that has a potential to confuse users. So maybe it makes sense to mandate a second parameter.
I think Jeremy's point on having the second parameter is if it's first, second rest here, then you can't have a.concat nothing. You have to have at least b there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's more natural. I think it's just. I also feel like when you actually look in the IntelliSense, I think it would just be cleaner if you have first, comma, second, and then either nothing or rest.
I agree that with IntelliSense it looks cleaner if it's this signature. It's just a question of, do we want to favor avoiding mistakes or IntelliSense?
No, I mean, I think your proposal also looks better in IntelliSense.
Oh, you think for second rest looks better?
Yeah. I mean, it's just, for the implementation, it's a bit shitty, but I guess we don't care that much. That's why we pay whoever writes the code.
I assume we're just going to have it return concat in terms of other concats. Like, I assume we're going to do this lazy and just return it in terms of the existing.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
So are we keeping the second one?
So
I
would say no.
Yeah, I would also say no to that. It just seems odd.
Like, if we think that we want enumerable.flatten of t instead of enumerable.concat of t of double enumerable, then...
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that is... I still think that this one is useful. If we can use a different name to avoid confusion, that's fine as well. So flatten, why not?
Yeah. I in particular, I think it'd be useful as well, but I think that this falls into a more general camp of there are a number of link methods that force you to pass predicates to do something, and if that predicate's going to be the identity or no op, then we should look at if there's either a way to handle that case better, such as by having a well-known delegate to handle identity, or by having overloads that don't take the predicate, or by having methods with different names like flatten that make sense. And I think maybe that's worth a broader look across link.
I'm not necessarily sure it makes sense in the general case. Like, would you do this for a group by that's missing a predicate? Would you automatically assign that to, the key is just the source element?
I don't think it necessarily makes sense everywhere, but there are cases like order by, where it makes sense to use the default comparer for T, or with select many, where it makes sense to expose it as a flatten operation. There will be some cases throughout link where it does make sense, and it'd be nice to see those together.
So there is a precedent there. Like, the by suffix generally implies that we're following the method with some kind of predicate. And in the case of, for example, distinct and distinct by, the distinct by method takes a predicate, but the distinct method does not. So I'm kind of wondering whether that suggests that we should be following a similar convention for an order method, for instance.
Right, and that was what I was saying. Like select many with nothing doesn't make sense, but a flatten API does. And so if we have an alternative name that makes sense, then we should use that. But likewise, if it does make sense to just drop the predicate, then that's a possibility as well.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm looking up what we actually called the. Yeah, that is T-source. All right. All right. So, yeah, do we think we want flatten called flatten?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. We can do that, or we can just have an overload to select many that takes nothing. I'd also okay with that.
I'd prefer flatten personally.
I think flatten's slightly more discoverable than select many with no predicate.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I always found select many to be not great lingo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if I'm going to be looking through the extension methods and I see one called flatten, I'm going to know exactly what it does.
All right. Do we have naming precedents for what we should call rest here? Or we can call it additional sources.
I think we normally call it something like args, or like if you look at string concat and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking at tuple, and I think there we call it rest.
Values, we use values and concat for string.
Yeah. Tuple
Rest, remaining
is trest. So. Yeah. Rest, others, additional sources.
I think rest makes sense, right? I mean, what?
Yeah, I vote for rest.
If you really want to be cute, you can call it ... Then I get in trouble on Twitter again for how .NET is being spelled.
All right. So first, second rest for concat, and then add a flatten.
Ship it.
in F# you can name it ... F# has a special escape syntax for names using backticks, and you can basically put any valid IL text in there, including spaces.
It's very useful for tests, by the way.
Yep.
Good.
Thank you.
Nice.
All right, HttpClient patches JSON async 60531.
Yeah, so I guess that's mine as well. Essentially, it's just a customer request to add, the same set of methods that we expose for the other common HTTP verbs for patch as well. I mean, the implementation sounds reasonable. The API surface is identical to the other verbs we already expose. I believe it's get, post, and put, and extending it for patch as well.
Yeah, I don't remember, but we didn't do patch. I think the reason we didn't do it was only because the existing APIs didn't have the patch overloads, because I'm pretty sure I looked at that at the time.
You mean the non-JSON APIs?
No, the other JSON APIs that the ASP.NET team built against JSON.NET. I think I took those as the starting point for the spec, and I think those ones probably didn't have a patch overload, would be my guess.
I think we don't patch overload HttpClient proper for non-JSON either until recently.
Oh.
But we do now, at least in 6.0.
Yeah, and it worked, but I think it just didn't have the accelerators for it. Like you had to say new HTTP verb, open quote, patch, close quote.
So we didn't have a patch method before? That's recent?
According to MSDN, it says it's in 6.0, which I thought we did it before then, but
well, I mean,
I mean the patch existed in the HTTP method class, but you'd have to craft your own HTTP request message until recently. I guess that's the point, right?
oh, there was no string overload, for example, or something like that. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess that's probably what they didn't add it to the original JSON
it goes
ones.
back to 2.1, so we've had it for a while. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well then,
I'm just reading MSDN wrong.
Yeah, I think those tables are confusing.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
All right, so then, yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm not sure why there's 4 overloads. It seems a bit excessive, but I haven't looked at them yet.
Oh, right. So the 2 easy ones, the 2 where you wanted to specify serializer options, and the 2 that work with the source generator.
Yep.
Well, I think so. That would basically mean 3, but I guess because we have one that because you also overload on string versus URI, that's why there's 6.
Yep.
Do the other ones are the other ones also overloaded on URI? I think the other ones are only having strings. Right?
I checked, like the API services are identical for the other methods. So.
No, I mean the other JSON ones do not have URI
2,
based.
3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, they're all 6. Except put,
I'm
which
looking
has
at the
more.
wrong one. Sorry, I'm looking at the. I'm looking at the
count
once again.
Yeah, they look like they're all 6.
Yeah, never mind then. Okay, then that's the one.
All right. Any objections?
No, it's consistent with what we have. So. No, there's a copy button now, right? Don't have to copy like a caveman.
What does it copy? Just the words. Why do I care? I can't help myself. Alright. It's long, but I don't care. Look at me not caring. Everyone should be excited.
So given that we still have time, and I think Stephen is not coming, like let's just take a look and see whether anybody objects to the proposal. I mean, Stephen proposed it, so I assume he's happy with the proposal. Would be my guess.
Well, I mean, the actual API proposal is something that I wrote up last week, and I haven't had feedback from Steven yet. But I mean, I'd be happy to walk you through it. I mean, that is basically salvaged from the API proposal that we did last year that kind of added all these behaviors in combination with cancellation tokens and timeouts. And eventually what we ended up doing was we kind of ditched that design in favor of the wait async methods that were shipped in 6 that only focused on cancellation tokens and timeouts. But we still need, in certain cases, the ability to await on a task without throwing an exception. So the idea here is let's try to expose an enum that specifies different behaviors that you can configure your awaiters with. And essentially the thing we're adding here is no throw. And the idea is just add overloads for configure await that instead of the Boolean that you all know and love, you take a task await behavior. And the idea is if you specify no throw, then no exception will be thrown. But obviously your async method will resume as soon as the task is completed.
So by no exception thrown, does that mean that if the task throws an exception, it's swallowed?
And what does task of T result return?
So that would not change for the case of the non-value task, right? The result of task.exception would be one and the same. The only difference is that the async state machine would not be throwing an exception when it's resuming operation. So basically what that implies is that if you're awaiting on a type task and you're assigning the result on a value, then that value would be default. For the case of value task, on the other hand, there is no way you could actually read the exception if you await on that value task with no throw configured, because you've already consumed that task. And if you're using an iValue task source instance that doesn't support reusing the tokens, then that exception would be lost forever, basically. So it is an open question whether we would want to expose no throw for value tasks. I think that we still do, but it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually worse than lost forever if you're a iValue task completion source thing. It's if you go to inspect it, you may now be getting the result of some other task that was launched after yours finished.
But on the other hand, value task doesn't have a .exception property, so the only way you could inspect the exception would be to re-await the task that you just now specified that you don't want any exceptions to be thrown. So I don't think that users would be making that mistake.
How trivial is it for users to check for canceled exception in the result?
So in the prototype, no exceptions will be surfaced, either if it's an exception or if the task itself was canceled. We could discuss whether that's the right semantics. We might want to keep throwing an exception if the task was canceled, although I think I can't think of a use case where that would be valid. Like the idea is you just want to resume your state machine as soon as the task has completed, no matter what the result is.
So I meant in particular, so you do await task, configure await, no throw, and and somewhere there's an exception internally that's thrown, caught, and then not surfaced because no throw is set. How do I check for the different kinds of common exception cases versus uncommon? Like, if I wanted to see is this default because it was canceled? Is there a trivial way to do that? If I want to see is the value default because there was some exception thrown? How trivial is it to do that?
I mean, I don't think that this particular use case would be supported here. This is a blunt instrument that suppresses any exceptions, and if you cannot consume, if you cannot read that exception, then tough luck. Like if you're looking for that degree of control, I guess the suggested approach would be to just handle the exception in the normal way in the async method using try catch. If I understood the question correctly.
Right. It almost seems like it'd be beneficial to expose something to track that state still, in the case where you want the throw implicitly caught.
I mean, there's no catching as such. Like because this is happening in the context of a state machine, you simply are not. The awaiter will be configured so that it doesn't throw the exception that is returned from the task.
So I think that we think that nullability analysis is a thing that we think that we might care about now. I think it doesn't really work because we added it to the language too late, but this completely destroys nullability flow.
Yep.
And I personally, I am pleased to see that Steve's original proposal, when he was the PM for tasks and wanted configure await to be flags, and then that got shot down and someone turned it into a Boolean because they could not envision a second option. I'm amused to see, that finally coming to fruition. But personally, I feel that this is a feature we should not add. If somebody wants a no-throw, they can make a custom awaiter. It's not hard.
Would it make sense to only expose this functionality in the untyped task then? Because
the problem is task of t result extends task. So we can't block it. I mean, we could make a new that throws.
I mean, that could work, but that kind of sets a trap for users.
Yeah. So
I mean, there is an alternative, and the alternative is we expose a new custom awaiter just for that use case, in which the result is actually nullable. I mean, we could do that, but that is substantially more API for this feature.
I gotta say, I'm a little unclear what the motivation for this is. Is it literally just to avoid having to type try catch?
It is basically to avoid throwing the exception in the first place.
So is it a performance issue?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea is that, and we have a use case like that in async serialization in system text JSON, where we want to await a task that could actually throw, but we don't want to surface the exception at that point where we await. We could, of course, do continue with, but that entails an additional allocation, which we would also prefer to avoid.
So Eric, in particular, I put a code sample in chat where I was trying to explain, or I'm showing what I was trying to ask earlier. So in particular, let's say you have task t equals some method dot configure await no throw. You then await the t. After you've awaited, because you've not thrown any exception, what is the value of t dot is canceled? What is the value of t dot exception? Are those correctly set?
So configure await doesn't actually return a task. What it returns is a configured task awaitable, and that is what changes. So if you await that awaitable, that doesn't in any way change the state of the underlying task that you're awaiting. So if it throws, then t.exception will be not null.
yeah, I feel that. So in most cases, an exception will have been thrown, because I don't know what it does if you do it inside the async state machine, in the async method that gets generated into the state machine, if that actually is throw, catch, save, or if it's throw with captured EDI. But if you called a helper method and that bubbled out through your async state machine, like that was a catch. So the throw happened. If this is saying we want to avoid the second throw, then if we want something like this to be in the framework, I think you need something that's not just a flag and a method, because it needs to change the awaitable to be basically returning the tuple of the T and the exception.
Well, this particular implementation should not result in any throws from happening. That's the whole point of the feature.
No, but it will. Like when you fire up, when you call the async method, it runs where it feels like running, so the thread pool. And if that happens to call into something that hits a line that says throw new invalid operation exception, that threw all the way back out to the state machine method.
I mean, you could be awaiting a task from exception. There's no throwing as such involved.
Yeah, in most cases, an exception will have been thrown.
Right. Yeah, sure.
I think the other thing here is it looks like the second enum value is the inverse of regular configure await.
Right, because you want the default to be the same as the default behavior when you await. So you need to opt out of continuing on your captured context.
Yeah, configure await false
is
right. It's not that the case is inverse. It's that the thinking that the default of bool is false doesn't, and so therefore configure await default doesn't match the actual default behavior of a task. Okay.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah. So to me, this is. It shouldn't just be a Boolean that makes a null start appearing in places that it otherwise shouldn't have. Yes, your no throw is specified on the line, so you can deal with it yourself, but it really feels like you're in a more complicated thing, and we want an awaiter that returns something more complicated, such as a tuple of the value and the exception.
I mean, that might be one approach as well. Or we might get to a point where we have discriminated unions and we have something like a result type, like either success or exception.
Sure.
I mean, that's certainly a valid approach, although that would also entail an allocation for what it's worth.
I mean, you can return the struct.
The approach that I'm thinking about is, if we exposed a different brand of task awaitable, say no throw task awaitable, that might be configured so that T result is nullable, and that would kind of not invalidate all the nullability annotations.
Right, but that would be something different than a configure await with a flag in it, because it needs to change what the type is now.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that would invalidate task await behavior. Probably I would instead advocate for just doing it on a task level, which means that we would have to throw if it's being awaited for the type task.
I think in particular, my concern is similar to Jeremy's, and I'm also concerned that there's just too much that's being lost with no throw that is likely important in the case that the value returned is default. I understand wanting to avoid the potential performance issue if around where we can avoid throwing an exception, but that all comes with I think most of that generally comes with the ability to still get that information, and that's where the general try pattern falls out from. You want to have that bool so you know it succeeded or failed. You want to have the ability to get the result, which is generally defaulted but not required to be defaulted. And there's potentially other interesting state that applies to task in particular.
Yeah, well, because for reference task, the task will now be in the faulted or completed state, or success, or whatever. It has states. One of them's faulted. But yeah, value task is you need to be able to get this data and get it correctly. So value task definitely needs a much more complicated solution than configure await that discarded data. But because really, this right now is basically they want task to have VB on error resume next, and no.
I'd also think that maybe where performance is a consideration of these exceptions, there's potentially a more comprehensive way for tasks themselves to opt into that, or that is for the logic that the task is actually running to opt into that, among other things. Like the fact that tasks are canceled via exception control flow is painful at times, for example. And that's a specific case where I could see avoiding exceptions being beneficial, and therefore you could imagine a different design that allows that kind of state to be surfaced without it flowing through exceptions.
All right. So, what do we want to say here?
I mean, it clearly needs more work.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reading the all the decisions we made on the original API proposal when we talked about timeouts, and it seems we were very hesitant to go down this path, and I think this discussion just keeps echoing that.
I also think if there's a specific performance scenario that we have, not a general one for like general users, but if there was something mentioned about serialization that I've forgotten at this point, but if there's a need for this there, then let's build something private and get the performance win without having to expose a public API. And we'll get some learning out of having built that and having, explored the usability issues with it. And we can reconsider once we've gotten more experience there.
But I guess that would constrain us to only using that in system private core lib. Would be nice if I had this in JSON.
I mean,
no, I mean just then
shared source.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
shared source, yeah, absolutely.
This is like 20 lines of code, right?
But that's it's basically prove it internally, and then we can make it public once we've figured out what it should do.
Yeah.
All right. I wrote down my thoughts. If I missed somebody else's thoughts, then
I guess one comment I have about that last remark you put in is, I think it makes sense if we're looking to make this API kind of accessible to the average user, but I think that's clearly not the intention of this API. Like for the average user, the recommendation still would be use try catch. So I'm kind of concerned that something like a tuple might be adding overhead for something that is fundamentally a, quote, I know what I am doing API.
well, we need it for value task.
I mean, sure, assuming that you really want the exception.
But yeah, right. So alternatively, it just is something that would need to be more, painful to use ish, right? So new exception blocking awaitable of the rest of the thing you were going to do, which that is an awaiter. It took its state machine. The await works on it because it'll follow the await pattern, and it wasn't configure await it was something that changed the shape of the awaiter. So, but
Even if you don't want the specific exception, don't you always want to know whether it succeeded or failed?
probably.
I'm trying to think of a scenario where I literally don't care if it failed, and I'm happy to just have the default value substituted in.
Yeah, I think that's the point I was making about the try pattern always returns a bool. So
Yeah.
at the very least, we should have a bool here. And then there's potentially a scenario where having the explicit exception type might be useful, like knowing that it's a task canceled exception and therefore it failed because it was canceled. That's probably the most common that you'd want to know.
Yeah.
And once you've got a bool here, presumably you've always allocated an underlying exception, right? It's not like you're saving by never having the exception object created. I don't know.
Right. The exception was obviously created because the method moved into the fault state, either because it's exception or task.from exception, or it hit a catch. The thing that would be saved is if the exception was never thrown, it didn't have to do the stack walk to figure out where it was. So exception task.from exception has saved the magic marker to figure out what the stack trace was later, but it hasn't actually built it yet. The weird exception dispatch info thingy.
Yeah, which was the general thing I was making as the other point, which was today things like canceling flowing via exception is a perf penalty, and if this is really about saving perf, then there's probably something that could be modeled so that you can save the exception, you can correctly save the exception dispatch info, you can flow that up everywhere, and then it's never actually thrown, so you don't actually have to incur the cost of throwing the exception, which is the expensive part.
Yeah, so needs more work. It's not something as simple as an overload to configure await. And then what we actually need, I think I agree with, I agree with what I understood Jeff to be saying, which may not have been what Jeff said, which is basically prove it out internally, decide what it is we actually want, what the use cases are, and then we'll know what the API what we think the API should look like.
That's what I was trying to say. Whether I actually said that or not, I don't know.
That's what I understood, so communication happened. All right. Comment needs work. And with that, I believe we are done. Unless something
Thank you,
snuck in.
folks.
Yep. All right. We have run out of issues and coincidentally practically run out of time. So with that, declare the meeting adjourned. See everybody next week. Yay for the gavel.
Bye-bye.
Tschüss.